The morning fog hung low over the Neapolitan harbor, the sea whispering in slow waves, as if sharing secrets only old sailors understood. Salt in the air, coal smoke from distant freighters, the kind of silence you feel more than hear. In that mist, a boy named Vito Genovese watched his father mend nets, hands raw from years of salt and rope. Vito didn't speak much. He didn't ask questions. He just watched. The men, the deals, the eyes that never trusted, even in prayer. From early on, he knew something about the world most boys never figure out until it's too late. Power doesn't ask permission. It takes. He was born in 1897, in a place where dignity was something you carried in your spine, not in your wallet. The streets of Tufino, a poor town outside Naples, weren't kind to dreamers. If you were soft, you starved. If you were proud, you fought. If you were smart, you watched and waited. At age 15, Vito boarded a creaking ship with his family, one of thousands chasing the American dream. But Vito wasn't chasing anything. He was studying, watching how people moved when they thought they were free, how weak men tried to look strong in the face of city lights. When they landed in New York, Little Italy smelled like roasted chestnuts and filth. Narrow streets, packed tenements, languages crashing into each other like waves. But beneath the noise, there was a different kind of order. A whisper network, rules that never saw a courtroom but were carved deep in the bones of every immigrant man. You take care of your own. You pay respect. You never forget a slight. That's where fiction bleeds in. They say the first time Vito saw a man die, he didn't blink. It was a butcher on Mott Street, loud drunk, owed the wrong man too much for too long. Vito was 17, delivering cigars for a cousin with connections. The butcher laughed at a name he shouldn't have said aloud. Within minutes, a black coat stepped behind him, a garrote cord wrapped clean. He hit the floor like dropped meat. Vito didn't run, didn't panic. He looked the man in the eyes and nodded once. The man handed him a coin, a silver dollar, warm from the kill. "Keep it," he said. "You didn't see nothing, but you saw everything." From that moment on, Vito Genovese belonged to no one. But he was useful to everyone. He started slow, numbers running, loan collections, watching older soldiers work their rackets. What set Vito apart wasn't his brutality, not yet, but his calm. He didn't flinch when others did. He spoke little, listened more, knew how to disappear without ever leaving the room. And when he met Charles Lucky Luciano, something clicked. Not friendship, not trust, just a cold mutual understanding between two rising sharks. They didn't shake hands. They just nodded, same as before. But let's not rush. This isn't just about bodies in trunks or whispers in back rooms. This is about a boy who stared at oceans and wanted more than bread. A man who would bend nations, rewrite Mafia codes, and become the one name even other bosses feared to utter without a drink in their hand. This is about how Vito Genovese became the boss of all bosses, and why sleep never came easy once he got there. The wind slipped between the buildings like a thief, brushing along brick walls and rusted fire escapes, carrying with it the heavy breath of coal fires and cooking oil from basement kitchens. Down on Mulberry Street, the city pulsed in low tones, wagons clattering, kids running barefoot, Italian curses flying from stoops where old women peeled garlic with fingers like claws. Vito Genovese moved through that world like a shadow with purpose. Never in a rush, never lost. He was maybe 19 now, but already he had a face that made people forget to ask how old he was. Narrow eyes, sharp jaw, a mouth that didn't like to move unless money or blood was involved. People were starting to talk about him. Not loud, not too bold. Just enough that whispers stuck in the air longer than they should. He was still working under his cousin by name, but everyone knew he had outgrown the errand boy phase. He'd begun organizing his own small collections, debts from card tables and pawn shops, quiet jobs, low risk, high discipline. He had 2 guys working under him, one of them named Franco, tall, fast-tempered, and reckless with his fists. Vito didn't trust Franco, not really, but he understood his value. When a message had to be sent quick, Franco delivered, and when things got messy, he kept his mouth shut. But Vito knew that kind of man always needed watching. The turning point came one rainy Thursday in the back of a butcher shop off Hester Street. The butcher, an old man named Petruzzi, had been short on his protection envelope 3 weeks in a row. Said business was slow, meat was scarce, and the city inspectors were making life hell. Vito walked in, water dripping from his coat, and looked the man dead in the face. He didn't threaten, didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, "Where's the money?" The butcher wrung his hands. "Vito, please, I got family." "So do I," Vito said calmly. "That's why I'm here." Franco stepped forward, cocky, knuckles already cracked and ready. But Vito raised a hand, stopping him. He picked up a boning knife from the counter, tested the weight of it, and then, without a word, sliced through the strings tying up a slab of veal. The meat dropped to the floor with a sick sound. He wiped the knife on a white apron and set it back down. The butcher just stood there, frozen. "Next time you come up short," Vito said quietly, "I'll cut something else loose." No shouting, no blows, but the message stuck harder than a broken jaw. 2 days later, the butcher sent triple, and a fresh cut of lamb on top. That was Vito's way. Violence wasn't just a tool, it was currency. You didn't waste it. You spent it when it bought something important. Word started spreading, not in the papers, not in the police reports, but in the streets. The kid from Naples was no longer just a quiet observer. He was becoming a force, calculated, cold, reliable. It didn't take long for Luciano to notice. By now, Lucky Luciano was rising fast, a mix of American ambition and Sicilian backbone. He had vision. He saw the old guard, Mustache Pete's like Joe Masseria, as dinosaurs, stubborn and stuck in Sicilian traditions. Luciano wanted something bigger, more organized. A crime syndicate that worked like a business, not a family feud. And in Vito, he saw the future. They weren't close. No shared drinks or laughs over cards. But they respected each other. Vito was one of the few who could sit in silence with Lucky and not feel the need to impress him. That silence meant something. In their world, words were often the weakest weapon. One night, Luciano sent for him. A quiet meeting. 2 men. No bodyguards. They sat on crates in an empty warehouse on the edge of the East River. The lights buzzed overhead, and rats scratched along the walls. "You work clean," Luciano said. "That matters." Vito nodded. "You work smart." Luciano smirked. "Let's make a mess together, then clean it up." From that night on, Vito was in deeper. He wasn't just handling collections. He was helping restructure. Luciano, along with guys like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, was building something new. Something that would outlive bullets and cops and courtroom drama. They started consolidating rackets, gambling, narcotics, extortion. Vito took charge of key pieces in the operation, especially dope. Heroin. The drug was risky, volatile, and dirty work, even by Mafia standards. The old guard stayed away from it, but Luciano and Genovese saw the profit margins and leaned in hard. Vito proved himself a mastermind in logistics. He set up supply chains from Europe, funneled product through Cuba, and distributed it across the Northeast. He paid customs officials, bribed cops, scared off competitors. The money rolled in, filthy and endless. But with power comes heat, and heat means risk. One night, Franco went missing. just didn't show up to a pickup. Vito knew before the phone rang that something was wrong. Franco wasn't smart, but he wasn't sloppy either. That left only one explanation. He'd flipped. Vito didn't panic. He didn't throw accusations or scramble his crew. He waited. 3 days later, Franco showed up. Not dead, not arrested, just different. Nervous, sweating, talking fast, said he'd been sick, said he'd needed time. Vito smiled, gave him a drink, told him to take the night off and rest. Then he sent 2 men, not to kill him. No. Vito needed confirmation first. What they found was enough. A marked envelope from a federal agent tucked in Franco's floorboards. The next night, Franco's body was found floating in the Hudson, face down, with both hands missing. No message attached, just silence. Everyone knew who did it, and no one dared ask why. That was Vito's real strength. Fear without explanation, order without noise. But fear, like all things, has a price. And in the late 1920s, that price came with blood. Joe Masseria, one of the last remaining Mustache Petes, saw the rising alliance of Luciano, Genovese, and Lansky as a threat. He called them traitors, modernists, disrespectful punks. And he was right. They didn't care for his rules. They wanted him out. Luciano, playing both sides, convinced Masseria he was loyal, that he'd root out the rats. Meanwhile, in secret, he struck a deal with Salvatore Maranzano, Masseria's biggest rival in what would become known as the Castellamarese War. Vito Genovese played his part perfectly. On April 15, 1931, Luciano invited Masseria to a quiet lunch at a Coney Island restaurant. They ate, played cards, drank wine. Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. Moments later, Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Bugsy Siegel, and Joe Adonis entered. 5 gunshots, no witnesses, no survivors. Masseria's blood mixed with spilled Chianti on the white tablecloth. Vito walked out without a stain on his coat. He'd just helped murder the man who gave the orders, and made room for the men who would build an empire. But the game wasn't over. Maranzano crowned himself boss of all bosses, a title Vito deeply resented. They'd killed one tyrant just to kneel before another. No, that wasn't how this was going to end. In less than 5 months, Luciano ordered Maranzano's death, too. A hit squad, disguised as IRS agents, walked into his midtown office and stabbed him to death, then riddled him with bullets. Clean, quick, ruthless. And with that, the old world was over. Luciano took over as the most powerful mafia boss in America, and Vito Genovese became his underboss, second in command, the man behind the curtain. But Vito didn't like being second. He never had. That ambition, quiet and boiling under his calm exterior, was beginning to crack through. He had tasted blood. He had helped shape the new order. But he hadn't claimed it for himself. Not yet. So he started to wait again. Watching. Calculating. Letting others celebrate while he built. Because he knew something they didn't. Every king eventually goes soft. And when they do, the knife comes from the man who poured their wine. The summer of 1936 rolled into New York like a bad storm. Humid, sticky, and thick with tension. Men in fedoras smoked too fast. Politicians whispered too quietly. And in the underworld, no one was sleeping easy. Not even the king himself. Lucky Luciano was on top of the world. His commission was running smoother than any mob machine had before. 5 families under control. The docks humming, gambling in every borough, narcotics through every port. He had politicians in his pocket, cops on payroll, and judges who forgot how to read the law. But Vito Genovese, his underboss, was watching him differently now. Not with admiration, not even loyalty. He was watching him the way a wolf watches another wolf start limping. Luciano had grown careless, comfortable. Women, whiskey, and late nights with showgirls took more of his time than the streets did. He was chasing legitimacy, talking about laying low, letting the syndicate run itself. Vito didn't believe in laying low. Not when power was right there for the taking. Then came the crack. In May, a special prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey started making noise. Young, sharp, and ambitious. He wasn't taking bribes like the others. He wasn't playing the game. He wanted Luciano's head, and he didn't care who he had to step over to get it. Luciano thought he could handle it. He was wrong. It started with a few raids on brothels. Some minor players got arrested, then one of them flipped. A madam, loud and angry, sang like a bird to save herself. Claimed Luciano was the mastermind behind a massive prostitution ring. It was shaky evidence, full of holes, but Dewey ran with it. He didn't need a perfect case, just a jury and a courtroom. Luciano laughed, said no jury would convict him on the word of hookers. Vito didn't laugh. He saw something in Dewey's eyes, the same thing he saw in the streets as a kid. Hunger. Cold, clean hunger. The kind that doesn't stop until it's fed. Vito knew men like that were dangerous, especially when they wore suits instead of brass knuckles. By summer, Luciano was on trial. The courtroom reeked of politics. The newspapers printed headlines like they were feeding a circus. Lucky Luciano, king of vice. The sinful syndicate. Vito watched it unfold from the sidelines, silent as always. And then, June 1936, guilty. Luciano got 30 to 50 years in Dannemora. Just like that, the king was gone. And suddenly there was a vacuum, an empty chair, a throne without a ruler. The commission met quietly, nervous. Some wanted Albert Anastasia to step up. Others whispered Lansky's name. But Luciano had left clear instructions. Frank Costello would act as boss. Vito Genovese would remain underboss. Vito agreed. He nodded, played his part. But inside? He was boiling. Costello was soft, smooth-talking, the kind of man who preferred back rooms to battlefields. Vito hated that. He thought the top should go to the man with blood under his nails, not cologne on his collar. But for now, he waited. Because Genovese had his own problems. You see, while Dewey was cutting off Luciano's head, he was also looking at the neck beneath it. Vito had been involved in every racket Lucky ran, narcotics especially, and the feds were circling. Vito made a decision most men wouldn't. He ran. Fled to Italy in 1937, under the excuse of visiting his ailing mother. But it wasn't about family. It was survival. Over there, things were different. Mussolini was in power. The fascist grip was iron. And yet, Vito found a way to thrive. Within months, he'd made friends in dark places, police, military men, black market smugglers. He carved out a new empire while the world moved toward war. While bombs started falling over Europe, Vito Genovese was living in a villa, eating fine meats and moving morphine across borders like clockwork. He had money, he had reach, and he was untouchable. Until he wasn't. In 1943, everything flipped again. The Allies landed in Italy. Fascism crumbled. Mussolini ran like a dog with his tail cut. The Americans started sniffing around. And suddenly, Vito wasn't welcome anymore. See, Vito had gotten bold. Too bold. Rumor was he tried to set up a hit on a U.S. Army interpreter who'd insulted him in public. That's right. In the middle of a global war, with soldiers dying and cities burning, Vito Genovese decided his pride came first. That move cost him. The interpreter survived. Word got around. The U.S. Army put a target on Vito's back. And by 1945, they had him in handcuffs. Not for racketeering, not for murder, but for black market crimes in a war zone. And just like that, Vito Genovese was extradited back to the States. Funny how the world works. He ran from prosecution, built an empire in exile, made himself untouchable. Then came back in chains like a stray mutt. But even chains couldn't hold him long. In New York, witnesses went missing. Memories got foggy. Charges fell apart. The feds couldn't pin anything solid. By 1946, Vito Genovese was a free man, back in the city, back in the game. But things had changed while he was gone. Frank Costello was running things now, quiet, methodical, politically connected. The commission liked him. Cops respected him. Judges listened when he called. And Lansky? He kept the machine greased from Miami to Havana. They didn't miss Genovese. Not yet. But he missed them. Or rather, he missed their power. He saw the softness again, the complacency. Costello was a businessman, not a warrior. He paid people to stay in power. Vito believed power should be taken, not negotiated. So he did what he always did. He watched, waited, and started pulling strings in the dark. He restructured his old crew, took back his territories piece by piece. No violence, not yet, just quiet pressure. Loans called in, businesses changing hands, old soldiers suddenly falling back in line. It wasn't long before people started talking again. Not loud, just enough to feel the tremor beneath the floorboards. In the Bronx, they said Genovese was gearing up for something. In Brooklyn, they said he was making alliances. In Harlem, they said his crew was moving more dope than ever. Frank Costello brushed it off, called Vito a relic, said he'd never be boss material. And that, right there, that underestimation, was the first crack. Because if there's one thing you never do with Vito Genovese, you don't underestimate him. He'd bled for his power, killed for it, fled and clawed his way back for it. Now, he was ready to take it, not with a vote, with a gun. And in the next breath of this story, one bullet would change everything. But that's for the next part. The night air was quiet, almost too quiet for Manhattan. A light drizzle painted halos around the street lamps, and the sidewalks glistened like wet steel. It was May the 2nd, 1957. To the ordinary eye, just another evening. People heading home, restaurants full, cars rumbling down the avenues. But for Vito Genovese, this night had been years in the making. He sat in the back of a dark Buick, engine idling, parked just 2 blocks away from Frank Costello's apartment on Central Park West. The leather seat creaked as he shifted his weight. His hands were calm, not shaking, not tense. He wasn't the kind of man who got nervous when death was close. Across from him, sitting low in the passenger seat, was Vincent the Chin Gigante, a hulking, awkward-looking man with a vacant stare and hands like hammers. He wasn't known for words, but Vito didn't need him to speak. He needed him to pull the trigger. "You remember the order?" Vito asked softly, not looking at him. Gigante gave a stiff nod. "In the head. No games, no mess. Just 1 shot and walk away." "Got it." Vito leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. Costello had ruled for too long. He'd played politics, shaken hands with judges, smiled for the press. People liked him because he didn't make waves, but Vito wasn't interested in being liked. He wanted control, and he believed control should belong to men who weren't afraid to get blood on their shoes. Tonight was the turning point. They'd already cleared the plan. Costello's routine was like clockwork. Every night around 10:45, he came home, walked through the lobby, nodded at the doorman, took the elevator alone to his penthouse. No bodyguards, no driver. He believed his reputation was his armor. And tonight, that belief was going to break. At exactly 10:50, Gigante stepped out of the car. A tan trench coat wrapped around his shoulders, hat pulled low, a .32 revolver tucked deep in his pocket. He didn't speak, didn't hesitate. He walked calmly toward the building's entrance, right as Costello's cab pulled up to the curb. Vito watched from the car, eyes narrowed. Costello stepped out, adjusting his hat, carrying a folded newspaper in one hand. Looked just like any other aging businessman, with a tired gait and soft features. But Vito saw through it. That softness had held on to his seat for too long. As Costello entered the lobby, Gigante was already inside, waiting by the mailboxes. The elevator doors dinged. They moved at the same time. When Costello turned the corner toward the lift, Gigante raised the revolver and fired. The shot rang out like a slap through the marble halls. But something went wrong. The bullet grazed Costello's head, slicing his scalp but missing the kill. Blood spurted, but he didn't drop. Instead, Costello stumbled back, shocked, clutching his head, yelling. Gigante panicked, bolted for the stairs, and vanished before anyone could stop him. Vito saw the aftermath unfold from a distance. Police cars, reporters, crowds. He lit a cigarette with a still hand, watching the chaos without emotion. The job hadn't finished, but the message was clear. And sometimes, the right message is all you need. The very next morning, Frank Costello publicly stepped down. He didn't name names, he didn't point fingers. But everyone knew. The shot hadn't killed him, but it killed his will to fight. He was tired. He wanted peace. And he knew deep down that Genovese wasn't going to stop with one bullet. He told the commission he was retiring, handing over the reins to Vito Genovese. It was official. The man who had once been forced into exile, who had crawled back from disgrace, who had waited like a patient spider in the dark, was now boss of the Genovese family, the most powerful mafia organization in the country. He had done it. But what most people didn't understand, what Vito himself did understand, was that power doesn't end with a promotion. That's where the real war begins. First, he cleaned house. Anyone who had remained loyal to Costello was put under scrutiny. Some were demoted. Others disappeared. A few chose early retirement. Vito didn't tolerate split loyalties. You were with him completely, or you were gone. Then came the expansion. Vito poured new money into narcotics, using connections from his time in Italy and Cuba. He strengthened ties with Carmine Galante, Tommy Lucchese, and Joe Bonanno, forming a stronger southern pipeline through Florida and Mexico. Drugs flowed like never before. Heroin, cocaine, opium. The profits were obscene. He started laundering it through legitimate businesses, garment factories, construction firms, even Catholic charities. He paid priests, bought off city inspectors, had judges on payroll again. The old machine was back, but now it was running on pure fuel. Every street corner whispered his name. Not with affection, but with fear. The kind of fear that made you double-check your locks at night. The kind of fear that made even rival bosses keep their heads low. Vito wasn't trying to modernize the Mafia. He wasn't here to make peace with the government or whitewash the syndicate's image. He wanted to rule like a Roman emperor, ruthless, absolute, and untouchable. But no one stays untouchable forever. The same man who orchestrated betrayals for years, who outlasted Mussolini, dodged Dewey, and put a bullet toward Costello, was about to step into his own trap. Because power makes you bold, and bold men make mistakes. It started with a whisper, Anastasia's murder. October 25th, 1957. Albert Anastasia, boss of what would become the Gambino family, was gunned down in a barber chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel. Broad daylight, multiple gunmen, no warning. It was a hit that shocked the underworld. Vito had a hand in it. Everyone knew it, even if no one could prove it. Anastasia was too wild, too unpredictable. Vito wanted him gone, and now he was. The streets knew. The commission knew. But someone else was watching too. The feds. And they were starting to put it together. See, the mob had grown too big, too obvious. Politicians couldn't ignore it anymore. and the government was tired of pretending the Mafia didn't exist. All it needed was a spark. One moment, one meeting, one piece of evidence. And that moment was coming. The cold November wind drifted through the trees of Appalachian, New York, rustling dead leaves across the quiet driveways and modest porches. It was the kind of town where people waved at each other from across the street, where kids still played stickball without fear, and where nothing much ever happened. Until the wrong men arrived. Dozens of sleek Cadillacs and black Buicks rolled into town that morning, crawling up the narrow roads like a procession of wolves dressed in Sunday suits. Local gas station attendants raised eyebrows. Motel clerks made small talk and took cash payments without asking for names. Housewives peeked out from behind curtains and whispered to each other over the phone. Too many strangers. Too many nice cars. Too many sharp suits in a place that smelled like cow dung and maple syrup. And at the center of it all was Vito Genovese. He had called for a meeting, a grand summit of the American Mafia. Not just the New York families, but bosses from Chicago, Buffalo, Detroit, Cleveland, Kansas City, Philadelphia, New Orleans. They were all expected to be there. More than 100 made men, all under one roof. To Vito, this wasn't just a meeting. It was a coronation. He had climbed through blood, betrayal, exile, and war to get here. Now he wanted recognition. Not in the shadows, not behind whispers, but in the flesh. He wanted every Don in America to look him in the eyes and acknowledge it. He was the boss of all bosses. The meeting was set at the home of Joseph Barbara, a friendly face from the Buffalo family, who owned a secluded estate with enough land to keep nosy neighbors at bay. It was supposed to be a quiet gathering, quick, unseen. They'd eat, talk, toast to the new order, and leave as if nothing ever happened. But Vito underestimated one thing. Small towns don't ignore big noise. The local state trooper, a man named Edgar Croswell, had been watching Barbara for months. He didn't have fancy resources or federal intel. He just had instincts. And they were screaming that something was off. Too many rooms being booked at once. Too much meat and seafood ordered for a man who lived like a hermit. Too many strangers suddenly showing up in tailored suits with out-of-state plates. And so, on the morning of November 14th, 1957, while Vito Genovese and his guests gathered around long tables, drinking espresso and talking about territories and narcotics, Croswell made his move. He set up roadblocks, called in reinforcements, hid in the woods with binoculars and watched the estate. And then, all hell broke loose. Inside the estate, someone caught wind that lawmen were gathering down the road. Panic spread like fire. Mobsters ran out the back, sprinting through the woods in handmade Italian shoes, slipping on mud and diving over fences like amateur criminals. Some tried to drive off. Others tried to hide in barns. A few just froze, unsure of what to do. They were bosses, not foot soldiers, and they weren't used to running. Vito Genovese was among them. He didn't run. He walked calmly out the back, hat low, jacket tight, and made it to his car. But he didn't get far. Less than a mile down the road. He was stopped at a roadblock and politely asked who he was. "Phil Romano," he said. The trooper looked at the car. "Romano, huh? And what brings you to Appalachian, Mr. Romano?" "Visiting a sick friend," Vito said without blinking. The trooper raised an eyebrow. "What's his name?" Vito hesitated for the briefest second. That was all it took. "Joseph Barbara," he said. "He's not feeling well." Croswell had his man. In total, 58 mobsters were detained that day, including Carlo Gambino, Joe Profaci, Joe Bonanno, and others who had never before been caught together in public. The media had a field day. Mafia summit busted in upstate Now Why? Crime lords caught like rats. Nation's mob leaders flee into woods. It was the first time the federal government had undeniable proof that a national crime syndicate existed. Up until then, the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover had denied it, called it folklore. But now, with mugshots and fingerprints, the truth was out, and it was humiliating. Vito Genovese had wanted power. He got exposure instead. In the weeks that followed, the Senate called for investigations. The press turned up the heat, and the underworld started to shake. The mob wasn't supposed to be seen. The code was always Cosa Nostra, our thing, not their thing. But now the entire country was looking directly at them. And who did they blame? Vito Genovese. He was the one who called the meeting. He was the one who brought everyone together. He was the one who wanted the crown so badly, he threw a spotlight on the whole damn empire. Quiet voices started growing louder. Vito's lost the touch. He brought too much heat. He's making us vulnerable. Vito didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, he tried to tighten control. He called for discipline, demanded silence, ordered his crew to lie low and resecure the drug pipelines. He tried to push the Appalachian disaster behind him. But something had changed. The fear that once followed his name? It was fading. His men were questioning his judgment. Allies were growing distant. And enemies? They started sharpening knives again. But the true betrayal? It came from a man he never saw coming. Anthony Tony Bender Strollo, one of Vito's top capos, someone who had been with him since the beginning, flipped, quietly, carefully. He passed information to federal narcotics agents, detailing Genovese's heroin operation, not out of guilt, out of self-preservation. See, Tony saw what was coming. The feds weren't going to let Appalachian go, and Vito's drug network was the perfect target. So Tony did what rats do. He gave the government just enough to build a case. Not on street-level dealers, not on low-level bookies, but on the boss himself. By 1958, federal agents had tracked a series of drug shipments from Italy to New York, passed through Cuban middlemen, moved into Harlem, and distributed into smaller networks across the Northeast. And at the top of the chain, they had one name: Vito Genovese. The arrest came quiet. No press, no spotlight, just a knock at the door. They charged him with conspiracy to traffic narcotics, using Strollo's testimony and wiretaps from his couriers. The evidence wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. They had momentum now. And Vito? He was running out of friends. In 1959, he stood trial in a federal courtroom in New York. He denied everything, called the charges fabricated, said the government was still bitter about Appalachian and looking for a scapegoat. But the jury didn't care. They saw a mob boss. They heard about drugs, murder, betrayal, backroom meetings. And they sent him away. 15 years in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. No appeal, no sympathy, just cold steel bars and concrete floors. Vito Genovese had clawed his way to the top of the underworld. Now he was at the bottom of a prison cell, surrounded by men who used to fear his name, and now barely nodded when he passed by. Even from behind bars, he tried to rule. He sent orders, held meetings, tried to influence the commission from prison walls, but it was never the same. The throne he bled for? It was already being carved for someone else. And in the quiet hours of the night, long after the guards had stopped making their rounds, Vito would lie awake on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of metal doors slamming, one after another, echoing like the closing chapters of a legacy written in blood. The walls in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary didn't care who you were. They didn't care about titles, legacies, or blood-soaked empires. In there, Don, boss, capo, none of it mattered. You were just a number. And Vito Genovese, the man who had once stood at the peak of the American underworld, was now prisoner of 18779. No silk suits, no loyal soldiers, No thick envelopes or wine-stained meetings, just a steel bed frame, thin mattress, and the distant clank of iron bars slamming shut behind broken men. It was 1960, and for the first time in decades, Vito wasn't in control. But he refused to believe that meant the game was over. Because men like Vito didn't accept endings, they just reorganized the board. At first, he kept to himself. He watched, observed the prison routines the same way he once studied the streets of Naples as a boy. He listened to the guards, clocked the shift changes, watched who got what from where. It didn't take him long to figure out who was moving cigarettes, who controlled the kitchen, and which inmates ran the internal betting rackets. You couldn't kill men in prison, not easily, but you could own them, and that's exactly what Vito set out to do. He started slow. He had visitors, a steady stream of lawyers, cousins, and business partners who came bearing books, religious texts, and envelopes. No one knew exactly what passed through those meetings, but it didn't take long before things started shifting inside. Vito had influence. Even locked up, guards started treating him different. Inmates stepped aside when he passed. He wasn't king in name, but he moved like one. He had men on the outside, trusted soldiers still loyal, still taking orders, still moving heroin, numbers, loans. His voice came through coded letters, passed through hands too afraid to break his chain of command. He was rebuilding. But power behind bars is different. It doesn't protect you. It just buys time. And time, in prison, is the enemy that never sleeps. Vito shared the prison yard with other familiar faces. Carmine Galante, another dope pusher, cold-blooded, ambitious. Joe Valachi, a mid-level soldier from the Lucchese family, nervous and twitchy. At first, these men nodded politely, kept their distance. Respect, mostly. But paranoia doesn't need a reason. It just grows. By 1961, something inside Vito started to crack. Maybe it was the walls closing in. Maybe it was the knowledge that the commission had moved on without him. That Carlo Gambino had quietly stepped in as the de facto head of the Mafia. That Luciano, even in exile, still had more influence from Italy than Vito had from his cell. Maybe it was the truth that scared him most. He was being forgotten. He started pacing more, talking less, trusting fewer people. His letters became shorter, colder, more demanding. He demanded results. He wanted reports. Who was moving what? Who was paying late? Who was falling out of line? He ordered hits, yes, from prison. At least 2 murders were traced back to his orders during those years. One was a low-level courier who'd lost a heroin shipment. Another was a made man who had been seen talking too casually with federal agents. The message was clear. Vito Genovese may have been locked up, but he wasn't gone. And then came Joe Valachi. Valachi was nervous by nature, jumpy. Not the type to lead, but good with his hands. Had done hits, smuggled dope, made collections. Vito never trusted him, not truly, but he tolerated him. Until the whispers started. In the prison yard, Valachi got into an argument with another inmate. Loud, aggressive, public. Vito was nearby. He watched with cold eyes, leaned on the rail, and said nothing. But 2 days later, Vito called Valachi over. They spoke quietly, alone. No one heard what was said, but Valachi's hands started shaking after that. A week later, Vito passed a message to a third man, and Valachi caught him watching from the corner of his eye. And that's when Joe Valachi snapped. One morning in June 1962, Joe cornered a man in the prison shower, mistaking him for a hitman sent by Genovese, and beat him to death with a piece of steel pipe. Blood splattered the tiles. Bones cracked. The man died within minutes. Problem was, Valachi killed the wrong guy. The man wasn't a hitman. He was just an inmate in the wrong place, wrong time. Valachi was thrown into solitary, babbling, shaking, sweating, convinced he was next. And that fear turned him into the biggest rat in Mafia history. Valachi made a deal with the government. Total cooperation in exchange for protection. And what he gave them? Everything. Names, families, hierarchy, initiation rituals. He told them about the commission, the 5 families, the rules of Cosa Nostra, the structure, the bosses, the murders. He confirmed everything the government had suspected, and more. And at the center of it all, one name kept coming up: Vito Genovese. Valachi painted Vito as the boss of bosses, the man behind the heroin pipelines, the one who gave orders from a steel cage and still made grown men disappear. The hearings were public, televised. Suddenly the world saw a man in prison whites spilling centuries of secrets on national TV. He held up photos, explained code words, told stories of backroom executions and car bombs. Vito was furious. In his cell, he paced like a tiger, teeth clenched. His pride was being torn apart, not by bullets or rivals, but by a mid-tier nobody with a trembling voice and a rat's spine. He ordered Valachi's death. Twice. Both failed. Valachi was moved to a special facility, isolated, protected, guarded like a crown jewel. The FBI knew what they had. And Vito? He knew the clock was ticking. By 1964, his power was bleeding out. His top men on the outside, Tony Bender, Mike Miranda, Jerry Katina, were moving on without him. Some quietly distanced themselves. Others started answering to Gambino. A few kept pretending to be loyal. But the money slowed, the messages stopped, the walls grew colder. Even his wife stopped visiting regularly. He was sick now. The stress had worn on him. His heart was failing. He coughed blood in the mornings, lost weight. His hands trembled when he wrote. He refused to let anyone see it. But in the silence of his cell, when the lights dimmed and the guards stopped watching, he stared at the peeling walls and wondered how it all slipped away. He had made it to the top. He had taken the throne. And now, he couldn't even command a kitchen knife inside a prison cafeteria. In 1969, after 10 years behind bars, Vito Genovese died of a heart attack inside the prison hospital. No big send-off, no national headlines, just a quiet obituary and a whispered phone call to the remaining lieutenants. They buried him in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, near other made men, near those who once followed his orders, and maybe even some who tried to end him. His grave is simple, modest, just a name and a date. But the story? The story is anything but. He was born in poverty in Naples, rose through violence in New York, built empires, betrayed kings, fled from justice, then returned to take the crown. And in the end, he died alone, surrounded not by soldiers but concrete and silence. That's the thing about men like Vito. They don't burn out. They don't fade quietly. They just go down fighting shadows, never realizing the last bullet came from their own ambition. The funeral was quiet, not silent. There were whispers, nods, handshakes, but no tears, no loud mourning, no eulogies to the man who once commanded kings. The grave at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village sat beneath a crooked oak tree, dirt freshly turned, headstone polished and cold. Vito Genovese was dead, and the world had already started moving on. He wasn't buried like a don. No public display of power. No black Cadillacs lined up for miles. Just a few old-timers in long coats. Some came out of guilt, others out of curiosity. Most came just to be seen, because even in death, the ghost of Vito Genovese still carried enough weight to demand a nod. But behind the stone faces, behind the sunglasses and the muttered Ave Marias, the truth was simple. No one feared him anymore. Not the feds. Not the commission, not even his own people. For the first time in decades, his name meant nothing but the past. And in that vacuum, the space Vito left behind, something new started to grow. Not better, not cleaner, just smarter. In the months following his death, the Genovese family didn't collapse. That was never going to happen. Vito hadn't left them in chaos. He'd just left them stagnant. The hierarchy was still intact. His top capos, Thomas, Tommy Ryan, Eboli, Michelle, Mike, Miranda, Gerardo, Jerry, Catena, and a few others, had kept the machine running during his time in prison. But they had never been leaders, not like him. They were caretakers, maintenance men. And now that the dictator was gone, the family had to decide, evolve or fade. The answer came from the shadows, not from guns, not from blood, but from something Vito had never fully understood. Silence. Carlo Gambino understood it. He had watched Vito self-destruct, watched him chase the spotlight like a moth chasing a flame. And he knew the lesson. The real boss isn't the man everyone talks about. It's the man no one sees coming. And in the years after Vito's death, that idea reshaped the very core of the Mafia. The Genovese family stopped using the word boss in public, stopped holding flashy meetings, stopped acting like celebrities. Instead, they created something different, a front boss system, a puppet, someone visible, someone the FBI could chase, wiretap, indict, someone they could parade in court while the real power sat 3 chairs back, sipping espresso, forgotten. It was brilliant, and it was exactly the opposite of everything Vito had stood for. In the late 60s and early 70s, Thomas Eboli acted as boss in name, but the real decisions were being made by Philip Benny Squint Lombardo, a quiet, patient man who stayed off FBI radar for decades. Lombardo didn't need power the way Vito had. He didn't want parades or recognition. He wanted control. Real, quiet, invisible control. And under his guidance, the Genovese family became the most secretive and structured mafia organization in the country. They expanded quietly into unions, construction, Wall Street scams, and the heroin trade, without ever drawing the kind of attention Vito had brought down on them. They didn't make enemies. They didn't start wars. They made money. Lots of it. Meanwhile, the rest of the Mafia landscape was changing. Carlo Gambino had risen to power without ever raising his voice. While Vito was dying in a cell, Gambino was building a legacy that would stretch across generations. He took the lessons of Genovese's fall and shaped them into an empire of silence, diplomacy, and deadly precision. And other families followed. The days of flamboyant dons like Joe Bonanno or Albert Anastasia were over. The streets didn't belong to the loud anymore. They belonged to the men who understood timing, politics, patience. Vito had ruled with an iron fist, but his downfall taught the Mafia how to rule with a velvet glove. Yet, even in death, Vito's shadow remained. His influence lingered in the things they never said aloud, in the paranoia that still hovered over commission meetings, in the whispers about loyalty, about how quickly things could go wrong if the wrong man reached too far. He had become a cautionary tale. Don't go full Genovese. That's what they would say in quiet rooms, when someone got too greedy, too loud, too reckless. It was like a Mafia proverb, a warning carved in blood. And yet, even in disgrace, there was a dark respect for him that never faded. Because Vito, for all his flaws, had balls no one else had. He took what he wanted. He didn't hide behind titles. He shot at Costello and lived to tell it. He sat across from Anastasia, smiled, and ordered his death. He stared down the commission and said, "You answer to me now." Yes, he burned out. Yes, he overreached. But for a moment he ruled the entire American underworld, and no one, not even Gambino, could say they ever truly wore that crown the way Vito did. In the years that followed, his family would become the model, not for their fear, not for their violence, but for their discipline. The Genovese family would operate with such stealth, such tight internal structure, that the FBI began calling them the Ivy League of organized crime. They didn't flip. They didn't brag. They didn't leak. They played the long game. Because after Vito Genovese, they learned the real secret of power. It's not who controls the streets, it's who controls the silence. And what of the world beyond? The government used Valachi's testimony to crack open doors they'd never even known existed. Federal agents swarmed into New York, Chicago, New Orleans. Informants became currency. RICO laws were sharpened like knives. The Mafia would never be the same. But Vito had already done the damage, not to the feds, but to the illusion that the Mafia was invisible. He forced them into the spotlight, and in doing so, broke the myth of untouchable power. That myth never recovered. Years later, in backroom bars and dusty social clubs, old soldiers would still bring him up. Genovese was a bastard. Yeah, but he was a smart bastard. He wanted too much, but he took it. Cost him everything. Still, for a minute there, he had it all. And in those late-night conversations, with half-empty glasses and cigarette smoke thick in the air, you could feel it. That strange reverence for a man who flew too close to the sun and caught fire anyway. The years do strange things to memory. Time softens edges, dulls the noise, buries the blood beneath clean timelines and sharp dates. People remember Vito Genovese now as a myth, a symbol, the feared Don, the cold strategist, the man who rose too far, too fast, and fell harder than most. But behind the headlines, the photos, the indictments, the whispered legends, was a man, one who walked into America as a poor immigrant boy from Naples and died behind bars with more enemies than friends, more scars than smiles. If you really want to understand Vito Genovese, not just the boss, but the man, you have to go back further than courtrooms and commission hits. You have to go back to before the suits, before the bullets, before the throne he built out of fear. You have to go back to his family. He rarely spoke of his childhood, not to his soldiers, not to his wife, not even in the quiet between wars, but people close to him, what few there were, knew he carried something from those early days in Naples that never left him. Poverty. Not just the kind that makes you hungry, but the kind that shrinks you, that tells you you'll never be anything more than your block, your name, your father's debts. Vito grew up watching his mother stretch pasta dough into meals that shouldn't have lasted a day. He watched his father bow his head to landlords, skip meals, whisper at night about ship tickets they couldn't afford. That's where it started. The hunger for power. Not just to have it, but to never feel small again, to never beg again, to never watch another man hold something over him. America, to Vito, wasn't a dream. It was a battlefield, and he came armed. By the time he was in his early 20s, he was already drawing lines between himself and other men. He didn't drink much. He didn't gamble. He didn't chase the same highs other soldiers did. What he chased was order, respect, and control. Women? He had them, of course. Any man in his position did. But love was never a priority, not real love. He saw romance the way he saw everything else, transactional. But there was one woman who stuck. Her name was Anna Vernotico. She was young, barely 18, when they married in 1932, after the death of Vito's first wife, Donata. Anna was striking. Dark eyes, proud posture, the kind of woman who didn't flinch under Vito's cold stare. She gave him a son, Nazareno Nat Genovese, and for a while it looked like Vito had finally built something personal, something beyond the streets. But that kind of peace doesn't last in a world built on fear. Anna stayed loyal. In public, she played the role of the Don's wife, the quiet hostess at family events, the graceful shadow behind his iron posture. But inside their home, it wasn't love that lived there. It was distance, silence, control. Vito ruled his home the same way he ruled his crew, with expectation, not compassion. There was no room for softness. His son, Nat, was raised not by kisses but by nods of approval. And if he failed, the disappointment came quiet and sharp. "He's not like me," Vito once said of Nat to a close confidant. "He wants peace. I never did." There were rumors, of course. Whispers that Vito had other children, that he kept mistresses tucked away in the Bronx or even back in Naples. But nothing stuck. If they existed, they were ghosts, like so many other parts of Vito's life. Things known, but never confirmed. Even among his family, he was a mystery. He didn't write letters from prison. He didn't speak often during visits. He rarely spoke of the past, and never spoke of regret. But there was one exception. In the final years, as his health declined and the strength left his once commanding posture, Vito began to change, just slightly, just enough for those close enough to notice. He'd sit longer by the window in the prison hospital, staring at trees like he used to stare at city skylines. He'd hum old Neapolitan folk songs under his breath. And once, only once, he was overheard talking to a nurse about the sea near his childhood home. "Blue as wine," he said, eyes soft. "Used to sit on the rocks, watch the ships come in, always wondered what was inside 'em. Gold, maybe. Bread. Anything." The nurse, barely 25, had no idea who he was. He looked like any other tired old man in a robe, fading. She asked him, "Do you miss it?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I miss not knowing how this would all end." In his prison journal, a small leather-bound thing he kept hidden until the final year, he wrote only a few entries. Most were scattered thoughts, coded in places only he understood. But one stood out. "I took what I needed. I made them fear me. I never asked for forgiveness because I never believed in it. But I do wonder if there's something beyond power, something more than being feared. If not, then I died the richest man in a poor world." No signature, just a smudge where his pen trailed off. When news of his death reached Anna, she didn't cry. She closed the window, poured herself a drink, sat at the kitchen table in silence. "He was always halfway gone," she later told a family friend. "Even when he sat beside you, his mind was somewhere else, building, planning, watching." And Nat? His only son? He visited the grave once, just once, laid down a small white rose, then walked away without a word. In the years that followed, Vito's name became more of a legend than a legacy. Young soldiers heard the stories, but they didn't feel the fear. His photo hung in some old clubs, but no one really looked at it. His rules were rewritten, his empire absorbed into smarter, leaner machines. But there were still nights, late, quiet ones, when older men would lean back in their chairs, light a cigarette, and say his name in a low voice. "Genovese, that guy? That guy didn't blink." Because for all his flaws, for all his failures, Vito Genovese had done something very few men in that world ever truly accomplished. He bent the world to his will, even if only for a moment. He died a prisoner. He died forgotten. But before that, he was a boy who clawed his way out of dirt, a man who built empires, a boss who didn't ask. He took. And in the end, that's the truth of Vito Genovese. Not a villain, not a hero, just a man who wanted the world to remember his name, even if it had to be written in blood. Power in the mob wasn't just about bullets and bodies. It was about politics, a twisted chessboard of alliances, rivalries, whispers, and silent wars where every move had consequences, and every handshake was just a heartbeat away from a betrayal. To understand how Vito Genovese truly reshaped the American Mafia, you have to step into the Commission, that smoke-filled, secretive table where bosses from across the country sat down to pretend, just for a moment, that they were civilized men. But behind the cigars and cordial greetings, behind the suits and Sunday smiles, was a world of ruthless maneuvering. And Vito? He was one of the only men who tried to dominate that table instead of just sitting at it. The commission was Luciano's idea. Born in blood after the Castellamarese War, it was supposed to prevent future mob civil wars. No more boss of all bosses, no more assassinations without permission, no more chaos, a council of equals, each family represented, major decisions put to a vote. On paper, it was beautiful. But in reality, it was a pit of wolves in nice shoes. Vito sat at that table early on, back when he was Luciano's underboss. He watched how power really worked. Who deferred to who whispered to who after meetings ended, who stayed quiet, and who spoke too loud. And he hated it. Because he didn't believe in equals, he believed in control. The first time he challenged the commission wasn't with bullets, it was with silence. When Frank Costello took over after Luciano's imprisonment in 1936, Vito stayed quiet. He didn't scream. He didn't whine. He just started building support, block by block. He met with capos. He listened. He nodded. He made promises in closed rooms. And when the time was right, he struck. The attempted hit on Costello in 1957 wasn't just about replacing a boss. It was a statement to the commission. I don't ask permission. I take power. And while the commission didn't say it out loud, many respected him for it. Because in the Mafia, men followed strength, even if it came soaked in blood. But once Vito had the throne, that respect began to sour. As boss of the Genovese family, Vito tightened his grip on the commission. He didn't just attend meetings, he dominated them. He pushed decisions aggressively. He didn't discuss, he declared. When he didn't get what he wanted, he leaned on alliances, called in favors, or made threats no one could prove. He wanted more say in Chicago's gambling rackets, more control over the heroin traffic from Cuba, more say in Philadelphia's leadership disputes. And the other families began to see the pattern. Vito wasn't looking for balance. He was trying to become the next capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, the very title the commission was created to destroy. Carlo Gambino saw it coming. Soft-spoken, sharp as broken glass, Gambino knew the best way to kill a king was not with a bullet, but with patience. He let Vito play the tyrant, let him bark, let him take the heat. And slowly, Carlo became the trusted alternative. He played mediator at commission meetings, kept peace between families, handled conflicts quietly, diplomatically. While Vito ruled with fear, Gambino ruled with influence, and influence always lasts longer than intimidation. The other families began to drift toward Carlo. Lucchese aligned closely with him. Bonanno, though ambitious in his own right, found Gambino easier to work with than Vito. Even parts of Buffalo and Detroit, once friendly to Genovese, began pulling away. Vito could sense it. And like any man who built his kingdom on control, he responded with paranoia. He began accusing his own capos of disloyalty, began punishing soldiers for imagined slights. Even within his inner circle, trust began to crack. His world, the one he fought to own, was starting to rot from the inside. But he wasn't done fighting. In 1958, just before his arrest, Vito tried to assert dominance over the Appalachian Meeting, an event he hoped would cement his supremacy once and for all. He summoned bosses from across the nation, wanting to discuss everything from narcotics expansion to international partnerships, especially with the growing heroin pipelines through France, Cuba, and Southeast Asia. What he really wanted? A formal acknowledgement that he was the most powerful man in Cosa Nostra. But what he got? A disaster. The Appalachian debacle shattered the Commission's trust in Vito. 58 mobsters arrested, dozens of identities confirmed, years of secrecy burned in a single day. Politicians panicked, cops doubled pressure. The FBI woke up, and who was blamed? Vito Genovese. He brought the eyes of the world into our house. That's what one Chicago boss said after the arrests. He got greedy. That's what another said in a quiet room in Queens. And Carlo Gambino? He didn't say much at all. Because he didn't have to. After Vito's imprisonment in 1959, the Commission slowly reshaped itself. Decisions became more democratic again, power more evenly distributed. And most importantly, Gambino emerged as the quiet, de facto leader. Not by declaring himself boss of all bosses. He was too smart for that. He simply became the trusted voice, the one people listened to, the man who never reached too far and never left blood on the boardroom floor. Exactly the kind of man Vito never knew how to be. Still, Vito's legacy in the Commission wasn't erased. If anything, his ambition forced them to evolve. They created new rules, no more massive gatherings, new codes of conduct, stronger lines between family and business, because Vito had shown them how bad it could get when one man tried to turn a council into a throne room. He didn't just fail, he nearly brought the whole system down with him. But here's the strange part. Even after all that, the chaos, the betrayal, the prison sentences, there was respect. Not for what Vito had done, but for how far he got doing it. They spoke his name with a mix of disdain and awe. That bastard nearly pulled it off. Because they all knew one thing. If Vito had been just a little smarter, a little more patient, a little more subtle, he might have owned everything. In the years after his death, his chair at the commission table remained empty for a while. Not because no one could fill it, but because no one wanted to be the next Genovese. Not publicly, not loudly, because in Cosa Nostra you don't rule by being the most feared man in the room. You rule by being the last one left in it when the smoke clears. The streets never lied. They whispered what the headlines didn't. They knew what judges denied, what cops pretended not to hear. And by the 1950s, those whispers all said the same thing. The dope money is different. It was louder, faster, dirtier. Numbers rackets made you a local king. Gambling gave you pull. Loan sharking brought in steady bread. But heroin? That was the gold rush. And no one understood that like Vito Genovese. While other bosses treaded lightly, calling it dirty business or too risky, Vito saw it for what it really was. The future. He didn't care about public image. He didn't care if the old guard called it dishonorable. He saw the math, the returns. 1 kilo in, 10 times the money out. The streets were addicted, and Vito planned to own the veins of the country. And he wasn't alone. It started in the shadows of post-war Europe, when the world was still rebuilding and black markets thrived. Vito used his time in Italy during exile not just to hide, but to build connections. Military deserters, Sicilian chemists, corrupt officials. From Marseille, through the French connection, heroin made its way into the underworld pipeline, disguised as legitimate cargo. Olives, linens, canned goods. A handshake here, a bribe there. Once it hit Naples, it was repackaged, stamped with false shipping documents, and sent to Cuba. a vital hub before Castro's revolution. From there, it slid smoothly into New York, buried in freighters, unloaded at the docks under the watchful eyes of paid union hands. By the time it hit the streets of Harlem, Chicago, South Philly, or Detroit, it was being sold by small-time dealers who had no idea whose hands it passed through. But the money? That always found its way back to Vito. At the peak of his narcotics empire, Vito was moving millions of dollars annually. He had distributors in Cuba, processors in Italy, mules across the eastern seaboard. He used trusted couriers, mostly immigrants with families, easy to pressure, impossible to trace. If they got caught, they disappeared before they ever said a word. And if they didn't, he paid them enough to disappear anyway. This wasn't street-level pushing. Vito wasn't slinging bags on corners. He ran a global narcotics syndicate, a full-blown, vertically integrated operation. And the terrifying part? It worked. The Genovese family became the richest organization in the country. His lieutenants, men like Mike Miranda, Tony Bender, and Anthony Strollo, lived like kings, quiet kings, tucked in corner booths, surrounded by money and silence. The other families took notice. At first, some mocked him, called him reckless. But when they saw the cash, they changed their tune. Joe Bonanno dipped in. Carmine Galante ran with it. Lucchese turned a blind eye but got his cut. Even Gambino, who swore he'd never touch drugs, eventually made quiet deals through his proxies. Because in the end, money always wins. But with money comes attention. And heroin wasn't like gambling or loan sharking. It killed people. It brought violence. It drew heat. And the feds? They weren't asleep anymore. By the mid-1950s, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics had started mapping the network. They knew about Marseille. They knew about the Cuban ports. They knew Genovese's name was at the center of it all, even if they couldn't prove it yet. That's when Tony Strollo got scared. One of Vito's most trusted men, Strollo had run heroin through Harlem, kept the Dominican dealers in check, handled disputes when violence wasn't ideal. But after the Appalachian fallout, Strollo saw what was coming. And what he saw terrified him. Strollo flipped. Quietly. No one knew at first. Not even Vito. The feds handled him gently, carefully. He passed them just enough information to piece together the pipelines. Names, drops, street dealers, handlers, phone booths used for calls, and most importantly, he tied it all back to Vito. Not in the streets, not in theory, but in cold, provable facts. And once the feds had that, they started building the case. They didn't go for a drug possession charge. That would have been too small. They aimed higher, conspiracy to traffic narcotics. The logic was simple. If they could prove Vito had ordered it, facilitated it, built the machine, even if he never touched a gram himself, he was guilty. In 1959, they made their move. They arrested Vito in dramatic fashion, parading him in cuffs in front of cameras, his suit pressed, his chin held high, as if he still ran the city. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, just stared straight ahead like he always had. His lawyers laughed at the charges. Conspiracy? They mocked. They don't have a bag of heroin, not 1 gram, not 1 fingerprint. It's a joke. But the feds weren't joking. They had witnesses. They had Strollo's statements, they had wiretaps. They had a narrative that painted Vito as the spider at the center of a deadly web. And the jury bought it. Vito was sentenced to 15 years in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. No parole, no appeal that worked, just cold walls and the distant echo of a legacy unraveling. But even inside, he didn't stop. He passed messages through lawyers, through crooked guards, through coded letters. He tried to rebuild the pipeline, and for a while it still ran. But the damage was already done. The narcotics empire that made him rich had become the sword that cut his throat. Because now, every boss who touched heroin became a target. The feds created new task forces. The French connection was exposed. Undercover agents infiltrated domestic and international crews. And when street junkies OD'd, they traced it back to Cosa Nostra. Heroin, more than anything, tore down the myth of the honorable mafia. It wasn't about protection anymore. It wasn't about family or respect. It was about addiction. Dead kids in alleyways, blood-soaked spoons, needles in playgrounds, and Vito Genovese, he became the poster boy. By the late 60s, even the commission started distancing from heroin. They blamed Vito for bringing too much heat, said he got greedy, said he broke the rules of omerta with his recklessness. Some even whispered he deserved prison, not just for the charges, but for what he did to the code. But those men? They took the money too. They always had. Vito never apologized. Not once. Not in court, not in prison, not to his son, not to the men who served under him. He believed until the day he died that he had seen the future of the mob, and he had tried to drag it there, even if it meant spilling blood across every inch of pavement between Harlem and Havana. He thought he could own the world through heroin. Instead, he left it behind, burning. Loyalty in the mafia isn't built on friendship. It's not about who you trust. It's about who's too scared to betray you. And for a long time, Vito Genovese ruled that way, with fear. He didn't have loyal men. He had quiet ones. Men who kept their mouths shut, not out of love, but because they knew what happened to those who didn't. But fear has a shelf life. And once Vito was behind bars, no longer untouchable, no longer giving orders with a look or a gesture, that fear started to fade. Whispers crept in. Questions hung in the air. And the empire he built started rotting from the inside out. It began small, a missed envelope here, a late payment there. Vito had lieutenants still running the day-to-day. Mike Miranda, Tony Strallo, Jerry Cattina, men he had trusted for decades. Men who had helped him crush Costello, build the dope pipelines, and tighten control over the commission. But now, they were thinking about their own futures. Miranda kept a straight face. Publicly, he was still acting boss, while Vito did his time. He said the right things, paid visits, signed off on Vito's orders. But behind closed doors, he was cutting his own deals, keeping pieces of the rackets for himself, letting certain crews operate independently in exchange for loyalty, not to Vito, but to him. Vito started hearing things. Rumors, mostly, but rumors are poison in a prison cell. He'd stare at the walls, picturing Miranda in his seat, sipping espresso with men who once feared Vito's name, now laughing behind their hands. He sent letters, demands, instructions, and most of them were ignored. But the real betrayal, the one that burned in his bones, came from Tony Strallo. Tony had been by his side since the 1930s, helped him build the Harlem narcotics trade, sat at his right hand during the Costello hit. They'd buried bodies together, moved millions in heroin, and held court over crews from the Bronx to Lower Manhattan. But when the heat came down in '59, Tony chose survival. He saw Vito's fall coming. He saw the way the government was moving, smarter, more connected, more relentless. And Tony didn't want to go down with the ship. So he flipped. Not publicly, not like Valachi. He didn't sit in front of cameras or scream names into microphones. No, Strallo was surgical. He passed information to the feds through a middleman, just enough to stay useful, enough to keep himself out of jail. And when it worked, he vanished. In 1962, just a few years into Vito's prison sentence, Tony Strallo disappeared. No body, no note, no witnesses. He was last seen leaving his house in Fort Lee, New Jersey, late at night. Said he was going to meet someone important. He never came home. The streets had theories. Some said the feds took him for protection. Others said rival crews got him. But the one that stuck? Vito ordered the hit from prison. And if that's true, it means someone in his own circle, someone close, carried it out. But Vito never spoke about it, never confirmed, never denied. Just smiled once. During a prison walk, when someone mentioned Tony's name. Still, removing Strallo didn't stop the bleeding, because betrayal isn't just a moment, it's a virus. And once it spreads, it doesn't stop until everything is infected. Jerry Catena, another top capo, had been Vito's financial brain. Ran the union rackets, controlled the construction bid fixing, and handled the money flow. When Vito went inside, Jerry was supposed to manage the cash, keep the family flush, keep the engine humming. But Jerry saw the same thing Miranda did. Vito's time was over. He didn't say it, of course. That would have been suicide. But he acted like it. He began investing his own money into separate fronts. Expanded into New Jersey without clearing it with Vito. Started moving heroin through his own channels, cutting out middlemen tied to the old Genovese crew. And the worst part? The commission didn't stop him, because by then, Vito had lost his seat at the table. The betrayal wasn't loud. There were no gunshots, no dramatic exits, just silence, just forgotten phone calls and broken promises, just slow isolation, like a man watching his empire turn to dust from the inside of a cage. Vito tried to hold on. He sent word to loyal soldiers, men like Vincent Gigante and Dominic Cirillo, but they were younger, cautious. They respected him, yes. They owed him. But they weren't going to die for him. Not now. Not for a man whose name drew too much heat, too much attention. So they nodded, smiled, pretended, and went back to playing the long game. Vito began to deteriorate, not just physically, though the prison years took a toll. His heart was failing. He coughed blood. His skin turned pale. But it was his mind that started slipping. The letters became angrier. He accused innocent men of betrayal. He rewrote history in his head, turning allies into enemies and ghosts into threats. At night, he paced his cell, whispered names into the dark, made lists of those he'd punish when he got out. But he was never getting out. And deep down, he knew it. That's the thing about men like Vito Genovese. They're not built to age. They're not built to fade. They're built to burn, to fight, to take, until the day someone takes from them. And once they're no longer feared, once they're no longer able to give or take life with a word, they die standing up, even if their body's already in the ground. By 1968, the Genovese family had fully moved on. A front boss, Tommy Aboli, took the spotlight. But the real power? That sat with Philip Lombardo, a man so careful, so quiet, the FBI couldn't even confirm he existed for years. They built a new structure, one that Vito would have hated. No loud bosses, no dramatic moves, just control and silence. And with the heroin routes now scattered across multiple hands, the money still flowed. But none of it found its way back to the man who started it all. When Vito died in 1969, he died alone. No grand funeral, no commission representatives. Not even a single capo flew in from Chicago or Philadelphia. Just a few aging soldiers, a son who didn't want the life, and the cold wind of a forgotten legacy. But in the hearts of the men who'd known him, really known him, there was still something. Not love, not pity, fear. Even in death, his name made them straighten up, because they remembered. They remembered the look in his eyes. They remembered what he built. They remembered what he was willing to do. And they knew, deep down, that they were only still alive because Vito let them live. When a man like Vito Genovese dies, the noise doesn't come all at once. It comes in silence over time, in the way his name fades from conversations, in how younger soldiers nod out of politeness, but don't understand the weight behind it, in the way his portrait, once hanging above the club bar, ends up in a back room with dust on the glass, But legacy? That's harder to kill, because even after the body's in the ground, his decisions live on, his methods survive. And the next generation of men, those too young to remember his reign, too hungry to care about history, still walk in his footprints, even when they pretend otherwise. And among them, there were those who bore his blood. His only legitimate son, Nazareno Nat Genovese, carried the name like a cross. Nat never wanted the life. He wasn't built like his father, not hard enough, not cold enough. He went to school, got a degree, tried to stay out of the streets. Vito didn't hide his disappointment. He's soft, he once told a close associate. Reads too many books, doesn't know what it means to bleed for something. But Nat was smart enough to understand that being Vito's son meant doors opened, and eyes stayed on him. So he kept his distance. He avoided clubs, didn't run crews, didn't sit at tables. When his father was sent away, Nat sent a lawyer, not a visit. Still, the streets watched him. Still, the whispers followed him. Still, cops and Fed agents had his name on file, just in case. But Nat kept clean, because he'd seen what the life did, from the front row. He'd watched the men come into their home in the early days, dripping confidence, laughing, carrying thick envelopes and gold watches. Then, he saw them disappear, one by one. Shot, flipped, vanished. Men with names no longer spoken. Men who once kissed his father's hand, now buried in cement. But while Nat escaped the life, the Genovese name didn't disappear. In the years following Vito's death, the family that still bore his name evolved, changed, adapted. And it did so by learning from his mistakes. Philip Benny Squint Lombardo ran things quietly behind a rotating door of front bosses. He knew the danger of being too visible, too ambitious, too greedy. He wasn't about parading down Mulberry Street in a white Cadillac. He was about staying in the dark, keeping the family strong, rich, and untouched by the federal spotlight. Where Vito had centralized everything, control, money, fear, Lombardo dispersed it. Decisions were made by panels, not one man. Street bosses were rotated. Orders came through layers of buffers. Every capo had a piece of something, but no one had the whole pie. And that structure? It worked. Through the 70s and 80s, when other families crumbled under RICO indictments and rats, the Genovese crew remained largely intact. Why? Because they no longer operated like a traditional mob. They operated like a corporation. And even though Vito would have hated it, his fall is what made that possible. You see, Vito Genovese became more than a name. He became a blueprint, not of how to rule, but how not to. His life was a case study passed down through hushed meetings. Don't seek the spotlight. Don't centralize too much power. Don't let ambition outpace discretion. Don't ever make yourself the target. The younger bosses learned that. Even men like Vincent Chin Gigante, once a loyal shooter for Vito, took that lesson to the extreme. Chin feigned mental illness for decades, walking the streets in a bathrobe, mumbling to himself, while running the most powerful family in America from a payphone. That was Vito's shadow. Still looming, still teaching, even through madness. But let's not pretend the Genovese legacy stayed clean. The family still pushed heroin, cocaine, extortion, racketeering, labor unions, Wall Street scams, but they did it differently, smarter. They avoided flashy violence, kept sit-downs brief, rotated lieutenants, paid off federal clerks, not just judges. The cash still flowed. Only now it was harder to trace. By the 1990s, federal agents were calling the Genovese family the Ivy League of organized crime. Efficient, disciplined, elusive, and every bit of that discipline was a reaction to the man who once brought the whole house down. Even outside the family, Vito's fingerprints remained. In Chicago, old outfit bosses warned upstarts about pulling a Genovese. In Philadelphia, men still told stories of the time Vito tried to pull the strings there, and how it backfired. In movies, books, documentaries, his name appeared over and over, not always front and center, but always there, lurking, because you don't get to rule the underworld, even for a moment, without leaving a scar. Still, not all of his legacy was strategy and caution. Some of it was pain, some of it was shame. The men who followed him, even those who respected his power, also feared the ruin he left behind. They saw how he ended up, in a concrete cell, his heart failing, muttering revenge to walls that didn't care. They saw the loneliness, the collapse. They saw the danger of losing touch with reality, of believing your own myth too much. And for those who were smart enough to pay attention, that was the final warning. Power is never permanent. The second you stop fearing consequences, you're already dead. Some tried to redeem his name, write books, give interviews, romanticize his war with Costello, the Appalachian Summit, the heroin empire. But even the most sympathetic accounts couldn't change the facts. Vito Genovese was brilliant, yes. Bold, absolutely. A visionary in his own brutal way. But he was also destructive, to others, to himself, to the very thing he claimed to protect, Cosa Nostra. Today, the Genovese name still exists. On paper, the family still bears it. But it's just a label now, a historical tag for law enforcement to track, for historians to cite. The men inside, they don't pray to Vito's ghost, they don't toast to his picture. Most of them never met him. Many barely know what he did. But without him, they wouldn't exist, because he built the empire, and then he became the reason it had to be rebuilt. That's the truth about legacy. You don't always get to choose whether you're remembered, but sometimes you do get to choose what you become a warning for. The mansion in Appalachian, New York, wasn't supposed to be anything more than a backdrop, just a quiet estate tucked away in the hills. Owned by a quiet man named Joseph Barbara, a low-profile mobster with health problems and a fondness for hosting guests. But on November 14th, 1957, that estate became the stage for one of the most disastrous miscalculations in Mafia history, a single event that cracked the very spine of American organized crime. And the man behind it? Vito Genovese. To understand the weight of Appalachian, you have to understand the moment. 1957 was Vito's year. He had just pushed Frank Costello out of power with a bullet to the head, a miss that still delivered the message. He had consolidated control over the Genovese family. He had his hands in international heroin, numbers rackets, unions, and political protection. But what he wanted, what he'd been clawing toward for decades, was public recognition from the underworld. He wanted every boss in America to gather in one place and say it out loud. Vito Genovese is the boss of all bosses. It wasn't enough to have power. He needed everyone to see it. That was his mistake. The meeting was supposed to be quiet, private, contained. No suits, no limousines, nothing flashy. But you don't bring over 100 mobsters from across the country into a sleepy upstate town without raising some eyebrows. The locals started talking, and one state trooper, Edgar Croswell, a man who didn't know much about the Mafia but knew when something didn't smell right, decided to check it out. He drove past the estate, saw cars with plates from Illinois, Michigan, California, New Jersey, Florida. Saw men in tailored coats, big sunglasses, slick hair. It didn't look like a family picnic. So he set up roadblocks. And what happened next would destroy everything the Mafia had built in the shadows. Inside the mansion, the bosses were just sitting down. Carlo Gambino, Joe Profaci, Carmine Galante, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Bonanno, Angelo Bruno. Even men from Chicago, Kansas City, and Cuba were there, heavyweights who hadn't traveled together in decades. And at the center of it all? Vito Genovese. This was his coronation. He had arranged the seating, planned the introductions, prepared a speech. They were supposed to talk business, union expansion, narcotics distribution, settling internal disputes. But before Vito could even raise his glass, someone came running from the front gate. "Cops! Roadblocks! They're surrounding the place." Panic spread like fire. These weren't street guys. These were bosses. They weren't built to run, especially not in handmade Italian shoes through the woods of upstate New York. But run they did. Some dove into the forest behind the house. Some tried to slip out back doors. Others got into cars and drove straight into police roadblocks. In the chaos, 58 mobsters were arrested. More were identified by name. Every major crime family in America was exposed. They had business cards, wads of cash, unregistered pistols, even code books in their pockets. Some claimed they were there for a barbecue. Others said they were attending a sick friend's bedside. One man claimed he had gotten lost. None of it worked. The media had a field day. Nation's mob bosses flee into woods. Mafia summit busted in New York. Gangsters run like rabbits from cops. The image was humiliating. Men who once ruled neighborhoods with fear and silence were now being paraded across newspaper front pages, mud-streaked and breathless, like amateur criminals. The illusion of invincibility, carefully built over decades, was shattered overnight. And it all pointed back to one man, Vito Genovese. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. 1. The government could no longer deny the Mafia existed before Appalachian. The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, refused to acknowledge the Mafia as a national organization. Hoover publicly dismissed it as an urban myth, an invention of Italian-American fiction. Why? Because to acknowledge it meant they had failed to control it. But after Appalachian, with arrest records, photographs, and undeniable connections between dozens of crime figures from coast to coast, Hoover couldn't hide anymore. He went from denial to full-scale war. He created the Top Hoodlum program, dedicating serious resources to target every major Mafia family. Federal surveillance increased tenfold. Agents were trained to understand the structure of La Cosa Nostra. Undercover operations were greenlit. And it all started because of one botched meeting in the woods. 2. The Appalachian Conference put Mafia politics under a microscope. Cops began mapping interfamily connections. Who sat next to who? Who arrived together? Who fled in the same car? They used that data to build the first comprehensive charts of organized crime, drawing lines between cities, crews, and syndicates. Suddenly, the Mafia wasn't just a New York problem. It was a national threat. 3. It gave prosecutors the ammunition they'd been waiting for within a year of Appalachian. Congress created a Senate subcommittee on organized crime. New laws were drafted. Wiretapping restrictions were loosened. Conspiracy charges became easier to file. And when Joe Valachi flipped in 1963, just a few years later, the government finally had the framework to understand what he was saying. Because they already knew the names. They already had the photos. They already had the proof. Appalachian had done the groundwork. 4. Inside the Mafia, Vito became a liability. The commission didn't need a vote to express their anger. They made it clear through silence, through restructured alliances, that Vito had overreached. They blamed him for bringing unwanted heat, forcing a public scene, ignoring the rules of secrecy. Carlo Gambino, who had once kept his head down, now began pulling strings behind Vito's back, building alliances with Lucchese and others to box Genovese in. When Vito was arrested the following year on heroin charges, nobody lifted a finger. No favors, No defense fund, no rescue plan. He was on his own. And the worst part? The Appalachian Summit didn't even accomplish anything. No policies were set, no disputes settled, no territories confirmed. The only thing it did was blow open the doors to a world that had spent decades hiding behind whispers and shadows. In a single afternoon, Vito destroyed what generations of gangsters had built. In his prison cell years later, he never spoke about Appalachian. Not to visitors, not to guards, not even in his rare, paranoid letters. But those closest to him say it haunted him. That in his final months, when his body was failing, he would sit at the window and stare out like he was looking for something, or running from it. Appalachian wasn't just a summit. It wasn't just a misstep. It was a turning point, the beginning of the end of the Mafia's golden age. It led to the RICO Act, to federal task forces, to wiretaps and informants and courtroom confessions that made the old guard shudder. It pulled Cosa Nostra out of the shadows. And Vito Genovese, he handed them the flashlight. The Mafia before Appalachian had a certain code, a cracked, blood-soaked kind of honor, sure, but still a code. Men didn't talk. They respected boundaries, not out of morality but survival. There were rules. Don't touch a made man without permission. Don't mess with another family's business. Don't make noise that draws attention to the life. Above all, don't bring heat. Don't be a headline. Don't be Vito Genovese. Because what Genovese did at Appalachian didn't just spark arrests. It shifted something deeper. A cultural fault line cracked underneath the entire underworld. The old-school way of doing business, rooted in silence, patience, backroom diplomacy, began to die. And something colder, faster, more profitable but unstable replaced it. The mob that rose after Appalachian wasn't weaker, not at first. In some ways it became more powerful, more calculated, more efficient. But it lost something. Something that couldn't be replaced. A certain soul. You could feel it immediately in the streets. Before Appalachian, guys dressed to blend in. They didn't flash jewelry. They didn't brag. They never let civilians see the full picture. There was pride in being invisible. After Appalachian, everything changed. The younger guys coming up started chasing the wrong things. They saw newspapers full of mugshots. They watched the old bosses flee into woods like hunted animals. And instead of learning from that mistake, they leaned into it. They started dressing louder, talking more, living for the image, just because they figured, if we're going down anyway, might as well look like kings doing it. In New York, flashy crews started popping up in every borough. Coke money poured in. Violence went up. The next generation didn't care about rules the way the Mustache Pete's did. They cared about power now, not power preserved. They used Appalachian as an excuse. The government already knows about us. What's the point in hiding? But that attitude? It was a trap. Because while the younger guys were chasing cars, clubs, and side deals, the feds were watching everything. And now they had the green light to go after the mob as a whole. Before Appalachian, they needed to catch you in the act. After Appalachian, they just needed a connection. If your name came up at that summit, you were on a list. And that list turned into indictments. They wiretapped social clubs, turned low-level buttonmen into informants, bugged union halls, restaurants, even funerals. The bosses tried to adjust, changed phones every week, used whispers instead of words. But they were behind. Appalachian had changed the tempo, and the Mafia couldn't keep up. Worse, it changed the internal trust structure. After that day, nobody fully trusted anybody anymore. Before Appalachian, a man's word carried weight. You could sit down across from another boss, break bread, and know that even if he hated you, the rules of the game kept you safe. After, everyone wondered who was next to flip, who was working with the FBI, who had been arrested at Appalachian and cut a quiet deal just to walk free. The first cracks of paranoia began to spread. Why was he let go so easy? Who did he talk to before the meeting? How the hell did the cops know? These weren't questions whispered by enemies. They were whispered by brothers. By the early 1960s, that distrust became institutional. The commission was still standing, but it wasn't unified. Some bosses stopped showing up. Others sent representatives. Decisions dragged. No one wanted to be the next Genovese, trying to seize control only to fall face first into a federal indictment. So they did the opposite. They pulled back, retreated into their corners, let their street crews handle more of the work. Started relying on layers of buffers, sometimes 3 or 4 levels between the boss and the job. It slowed things down, but it kept them alive. But even that came with a cost. The more you delegate, the more power you lose. By the late 1960s, entire Mafia rackets were being controlled by independent crews, only loosely connected to their parent family. Some guys kicked up late. Others lied about profits. A few started side dealing with other organizations, cartels, biker gangs, foreign syndicates. Before Appalachian, this would have been a death sentence. After, it became common, because the bosses didn't have the energy or the reach to rein it all in. Not anymore. Appalachian also marked the beginning of a larger shift from honor to greed. Once upon a time, being made meant something sacred, a ceremony, a lifetime commitment. After Appalachian, it became a job title. Guys didn't get made because of loyalty anymore. They got made because they brought in money. The more you earned, the higher you rose, even if you were reckless, even if you didn't follow tradition, even if you didn't respect the code. As long as the envelopes came in fat, the bosses looked the other way. Some of the old-timers tried to hold the line. Carlo Gambino was one. He kept things conservative, worked from the shadows, avoided drugs, encouraged diplomacy. But even he couldn't stop the tide. After his death in 1976, his family splintered. Paul Castellano took over, more businessman than gangster. And when John Gotti came up, loud, violent, media-hungry, he didn't just kill Castellano. He killed the old way of being a boss. He embraced the spotlight. He dressed like a movie star. Smiled in courtrooms, laughed at reporters, and the people loved him. The FBI, too, because the more attention you seek, the easier you are to bring down. But this wasn't just a Gambino problem. Every family, Genovese included, felt the shift. Young soldiers started asking, why follow the rules when they don't protect us anymore? Why kick up when the bosses are hiding in Florida? Why stay quiet when the world wants to see what we are? That tension between the old code and the new culture created an identity crisis, one the Mafia never fully recovered from. The irony? Vito Genovese caused all of it by trying to do the opposite. He wanted to unify the families, wanted to bring power back under one banner, wanted to revive the old Sicilian model of a supreme don with absolute control. But in trying to centralize power, he exposed everyone. His obsession with visibility, with recognition, shattered the illusion of the Mafia's secrecy. And the bosses that followed? Spent the rest of their lives trying to stitch that illusion back together, with duct tape and denial. That's what made Appalachian more than a botched meeting. It was a pivot point, the moment when the Mafia stopped being invisible and started becoming vulnerable. From that day forward, the families were no longer shadows on a wall. They were names on a board, faces in a folder, charts on a wall at FBI headquarters. And once the feds could see you, they never stopped chasing. By the 1980s and 1990s, when RICO laws tore through the Mafia like wildfire, the seeds of destruction had already been planted 30 years earlier in that backyard in Appalachian, surrounded by Cadillacs and panic. And the man at the center of it? He died alone in prison, Heart failing, powerless, still calling himself the boss of bosses. You can draw a straight line from Appalachian to the moment when Rico crushed the Mafia, and Vito Genovese was the pen that drew it. He didn't mean to. He never saw himself as a man who'd open the door for law enforcement to rip apart the world he helped build. But that's exactly what happened. Because Vito's need for dominance, for visibility, for that one final power grab, gave the government the one thing they'd never had before: a map. And from that map came the war machine. For decades before Appalachian, J. Edgar Hoover denied the Mafia existed, not just to the public, but to his own agents. Why? Because Hoover cared about image, not results. He focused on communist threats, bank robbers, and headline-grabbing lone wolves, fighting an invisible syndicate with old-world traditions and silent murders. That didn't sell well. And besides, going after the mob meant going after entire institutions that fed off the Mafia's money. Unions, judges, politicians, ports, cops. Too messy, too big, too dangerous. So Hoover looked away for years. But Appalachian changed everything. You can't deny the Mafia exists when dozens of its leaders are caught together in a single place, all lying about why they're there. The papers tore into it. Senators screamed for action. The public, already suspicious, now had proof: photos, arrest records, transcripts. And Hoover? He panicked. And when a man like Hoover panics, he doesn't retreat. He retaliates. First came the Top Hoodlum Program, a dedicated FBI initiative to identify and track major Mafia players in every city. Each field office received marching orders: create informants, dig into families, monitor unions, coordinate with local police. The Mafia was now a target, and Genovese's name sat right at the center of every chart. But that wasn't enough, because even with all the heat, mobsters weren't flipping. They still followed the code, omerta, the sacred vow of silence. Men went to prison and did their time. They didn't name names. They didn't testify. That code had survived for decades, but it wouldn't survive Joe Valachi. Valachi was a small man, a soldier, not important in the grand scheme. But inside prison, in the same walls as Vito Genovese, he started to crack. He believed Vito had put a contract on his head. He was paranoid, isolated, convinced that any day now, someone would shank him in the yard or poison his food. So he did what no made man had done before. He talked. In 1963, Valachi sat before the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Organized Crime and broke the biggest rule in Mafia history. He named names, explained how you become a made man, revealed the existence of the commission, outlined family structures in New York, Chicago, Detroit, New Orleans. He gave nicknames, crew locations, even murder rituals. Millions watched on TV. It was the first time America saw the Mafia not as myth, but as a functioning, organized business. And Valachi didn't hold back. He pointed the finger straight at Vito Genovese, describing him as one of the most feared and ambitious bosses in the country. Valachi's testimony broke the seal. He made it acceptable, even patriotic, to betray the Mafia. And more importantly, he gave the FBI what they needed most: validation. They now had an insider roadmap. Suddenly, every field agent knew the difference between a capo and a consigliere. Every prosecutor had the language to file stronger indictments. Every cop understood why certain murders were never solved, because they were ordered, not random. The code was no longer sacred. It was shattered. But the real killer blow came a few years later. In 1970, Congress passed the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. It changed everything. Before RICO, law enforcement could only charge individuals for specific crimes. If they wanted to take down a mob boss, They had to catch him in the act, or tie him directly to a murder, extortion, or loan sharking case. RICO changed the rules of the game. Now, prosecutors didn't have to prove who pulled the trigger or who made the threat. They only had to prove that the accused was part of a criminal enterprise, that they gave orders, that they profited from crimes committed by others. If a soldier beat someone up over a debt, and a captain got a cut of that debt, and the boss oversaw that captain, all three could go down together. The law was built with the Mafia in mind, and they tested it like a weapon. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, federal prosecutors used RICO to dismantle family after family. They took down Paul Castellano, Tony Accardo, Vincent Gigante, Joe Massino, John Gotti, and dozens more. Each trial was stacked with informants, soldiers, capos, even bosses, who once swore they'd never break. Now, they traded secrets for lighter sentences, traded omertà for witness protection, traded the Mafia for a future. The government built witness protection into a weapon. They gave rats new names, new homes, jobs, fake families, security. They made betrayal easy, safe, rewarding. The days of loyalty unto death were over. The idea of taking your secrets to the grave? Dead. And all of that, every wiretap, every snitch, every massive RICO case, it all traces back to Vito Genovese. He didn't flip. He never testified. But by forcing the Mafia into the spotlight, by pulling every boss in America into one visible place, he gave the government exactly what it needed, a reason to go all in. He exposed the web, and once the feds saw it, they never stopped pulling. Even within the underworld, the shame never faded. Old-timers never forgave Vito for Appalachian, never forgave him for making himself the center of attention, for putting ambition ahead of the code. In backroom bars, they'd still mutter it. He should have stayed in the shadows. He gave them the tools to bury us. He wanted to be king and dragged us all into war. And it was true. Before Appalachian, the Mafia was untouchable. After it, they were vulnerable. By the time the 1990s arrived, the damage was done. The Mafia wasn't dead, but it was crippled. The commission had stopped meeting. Dozens of bosses were gone. Entire families like the once powerful Colombo or Detroit partnership were shadows of what they used to be. And the Genovese family? Still running. But they were no longer the family of Vito Genovese. They had become something else. A disciplined machine of silence. No single boss, just a structure, a shell, a reminder of what once was and what almost destroyed them. That's the bitter truth. Vito Genovese was one of the most powerful men the Mafia ever produced, but he was also one of the most dangerous to its survival. His desire to rule, his refusal to wait, his belief that fear was enough to hold it all together. It gave the world the cracks it needed to burn the whole thing down. The end of a gangster story is usually written in blood. A car bomb, a bullet in the back of the head, a body found in a ditch or dumped in a canal. But Vito Genovese didn't die like that. He died slowly, quietly, alone. On February 14th, 1969, in a prison hospital bed in Springfield, Missouri, the man who once ruled over one of the most powerful criminal empires in America took his last breath with no fanfare, no entourage, and no second chance. The doctors listed it as a heart attack. But the truth? Vito's heart had been breaking for years, not from grief, not from guilt, but from watching the empire he built, brick by bloody brick, move on without him. By the time he died, the world had already started forgetting him. Younger wise guys didn't know his voice, didn't recognize his face. His photo might have been pinned on a corkboard in some backroom FBI office, but in the streets? His name was a ghost. There were no headlines when he passed, no sirens, no massive funeral, Just a notice, a file update, another dead mobster in federal custody. They'd buried him in St. John's Cemetery, next to other made men, beneath the cold New York soil, quiet, unremarkable, surrounded by silence. But that silence? It was deceptive. Because Vito Genovese never really left. Every time a young soldier picked power over patience, every time a boss pushed too far, too fast, every time a family fractured under its own ambition, Vito's story was being repeated, not directly, not by name, but by blueprint. Because what Vito represented wasn't just a man. He was a mirror, showing what happens when power becomes obsession. Let's strip it all the way down. Who was he? A poor Neapolitan immigrant, one of millions. A boy who crossed the ocean chasing a dream, only to find that America doesn't hand anything out. You have to take it. And that's exactly what Vito did. He took streets from rival gangs. He took political protection with cash and blood. He took out bosses, Masseria, Costello, Anastasia, not because he had to, but because he could. He didn't wait for permission. He created his own lane, and anyone who stepped into it got buried. But what did it cost him? That's the part most people skip. It cost him peace. It cost him his son, his marriage, his legacy. It cost him the respect of the men he needed most. It cost him allies who turned into enemies. It cost him silence, which in the Mafia is the most precious currency there is. And worst of all, it cost him the very thing he chased his entire life: control. In the end, Vito Genovese died not in power, but in memory, a cautionary tale passed down in whispers, usually with a drink in hand and a shake of the head. Vito, smart guy, too smart for his own good. Could have had it all if he just played it cool. He thought he was untouchable. Nobody is. But it would be a mistake to call him a failure. Vito Genovese did something no other man in his world ever truly achieved. For a brief moment in time, maybe a year, maybe just a season, he had it all. The streets, the bosses, the fear, the respect. He sat at the top, not behind the curtain but front and center. He didn't hide in Florida, didn't pretend to be a businessman, didn't settle for scraps. He wanted the whole table, and he took it. That is power, even if it didn't last. So what's the final truth? What does Vito's story really mean? It means this life doesn't reward kings. It rewards ghosts, the ones who stay quiet, the ones who never make the front page, the ones who die old and rich in their bed with no one the wiser. Vito couldn't be that. He was too loud, too driven, too hungry, and for that he paid the price. But the streets never forget entirely. Not really. Somewhere in a backroom club in the Bronx, there's still an old man who swears he saw Vito order a hit with a nod. Somewhere in Naples, there's still a cousin who tells stories about the boy who came to America and became a god. Somewhere in the archives of the FBI, there's still a redacted document with Vito's name circled in black ink, marked as Priority 1. And somewhere in the DNA of every boss who came after him, there's a warning stitched deep. Don't be Genovese, or if you are, don't fall like him. That's the legacy. A man who rose too high, too fast. A man who held the underworld in his grip and squeezed until it cracked. A man who thought fear was enough, that bullets could solve everything, that reputation could outrun reality. And in the end, he was wrong. But he almost wasn't. And that almost? That's why they still whisper his name.